Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Vera Castellanos, and 6 months ago, I never would have believed that empty spaces could have architecture. I was a geographer, still am, technically, though I haven't updated my university profile since February. My specialty was liminal zones, border regions, contested territories, places where one jurisdiction bleeds into another without clear demarcation. I wrote my dissertation on the psychological effects of indefinite boundaries, won a modest grant to study disputed lands in the Caucasus, published papers that 36 people read. It was honest work, the kind that filled my days with datasets and satellite imagery, the comfortable distance of academic observation between myself and the subjects I studied. The offer came through a colleague, Dr. Marcus Uvendell, whom I'd met twice at conferences and exchanged perhaps a dozen emails with over the years, mostly regarding footnote corrections and citation requests. He worked for something called the Territorial Census Bureau, a name so deliberately bland it could only be governmental. His email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, subject line, "Unusual consultation opportunity. Your expertise needed." The message was brief. A mapping project in the Pacific Northwest, duration of 3 weeks, compensation that made my annual salary look like a rounding error. The work involved documenting an anomalous geographical feature that required someone with my specific background in liminal spaces and cartographic psychology. Discretion was essential. A non-disclosure agreement would be required before any further details could be shared. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why a census bureau needed a geographer specializing in psychological borders, should have noticed how Marcus's usually verbose academic prose had been stripped down to bare procedural language, each sentence carrying the weight of words he wasn't allowed to say. But my department was facing budget cuts. My partner Alina had left 3 months prior, taking half the furniture and all of the certainty I'd built my adult life around. The apartment felt too large and too empty, and I'd started measuring my days by how many hours I could avoid being inside it. When you're that particular brand of desperate, not for money exactly, but for purpose, for forward motion, for anything that feels like it matters, you don't interrogate good fortune too closely. I signed the NDA electronically, watched the confirmation appear in my inbox with a speed that suggested automated systems waiting for my compliance. Within an hour, a courier arrived at my office with a padded envelope containing a phone basic smartphone, no brand markings, and a handwritten note in Marcus's cramped script. Use only this device for project communication. Arrives Friday. Coordinates and details attached. The phone's only installed application besides basic functions was a secure messaging system, white interface with no company branding. A single conversation thread waited, timestamp showing it had been created the moment I'd signed the agreement. The message contained coordinates, a meeting time of 2:00 p.m. on Friday, and an address in Bellingham, Washington for something called the Northwest Regional Documentation Facility. I spent the next 3 days trying to research the Territorial Census Bureau. The organization existed, technically, occasional mentions in congressional budget documents, a paragraph in a GAO report about interagency coordination. But no website, no public-facing presence, no clear mandate beyond vague language about comprehensive territorial documentation and liminal zone assessment. The kind of bureaucratic ghost that lived in the gaps between more famous agencies, doing work that apparently required enough funding to offer me 6 figures for 3 weeks of consultation, but not enough visibility to justify public accountability. The flight to Seattle was unremarkable. I'd packed for field work: sturdy boots, weather-appropriate layers, my laptop with its collection of mapping software and survey tools. The rental car was waiting as promised, a gray sedan with Washington plates and a GPS unit pre-programmed with my destination. I drove north through rain that felt more like atmosphere than weather, the landscape gradually shifting from urban sprawl to something older, more indifferent to human presence. Bellingham appeared through the mist like a city that couldn't quite commit to existing. Victorian buildings pressed against modern construction, the whole place caught between maritime heritage and tech economy aspiration. I followed the GPS instructions through increasingly sparse commercial districts until pavement gave way to gravel and gravel to dirt, the road narrowing as forest closed in on both sides. The Northwest Regional Documentation Facility announced itself with no announcement at all. One moment I was driving through unbroken pine forest, and the next, a gap appeared in the trees revealing a parking area and a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd been told what government facilities were supposed to look like, but had never actually seen one. Single-story, prefabricated construction, that particular shade of beige that suggested bulk purchasing and institutional indifference. 3 other vehicles occupied the lot: 2 unmarked vans and a truck that might have belonged to a utility company. I parked and sat for a moment, watching rain pattern the windshield. The building had no visible signage, no indication of purpose or affiliation. Windows reflected forest, their tint making it impossible to see inside. A single door, metal with a card reader beside it, offered the only obvious entrance. The secure phone buzzed. "You're expected. Door will unlock when you approach. Proceed to conference room A." I'd worked on enough government projects to recognize the aesthetic of deliberate minimalism. Agencies that didn't want to be noticed cultivated a specific kind of architectural nothing. Spaces so aggressively generic they slipped past attention, camouflaged by their own bureaucratic banality. But as I approached the building, I felt the first stirring of something that wasn't quite unease. Not yet. Just a sense of scale slightly wrong, proportions that didn't quite resolve into coherent geometry. The door unlocked with a soft click as I reached for it. Inside, fluorescent lighting illuminated a corridor that extended farther than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. Gray carpet, white walls, ceiling tiles that showed water stains in patterns that might have been random. The air tasted recycled, climate-controlled into perfect neutrality, carrying no scent of the forest pressing against the structure's walls. Conference room A waited 20 yards down the corridor, door propped open, revealing a space that could have belonged to any corporate office anywhere in America. Rectangular table, 8 chairs with ergonomic mesh backs, a presentation screen on one wall. Marcus Ovendell stood beside the table, looking older than his faculty photo suggested. Hair gone entirely gray, suit rumpled in a way that spoke of either deliberate academic affectation or genuine disregard for appearance. "Dr. Castellanos, thank you for coming." His handshake was firm, palms slightly damp. "I appreciate your discretion." 2 other people occupied the room. A woman in her 50s, severe suit and severely pulled back hair, introduced herself as Director Sarah Klein, though director of what remained unspecified. And a younger man, maybe 30, casual clothes under a government tissue jacket, who nodded when Marcus said his name, Christopher Webb, but didn't offer his hand or his function. "Please sit." Director Klein gestured to a chair. "We have a great deal to cover, and I'm afraid much of it will sound impossible until you've seen the site itself." I sat. Christopher Webb closed the door with a finality that made my throat tighten slightly, though I couldn't have articulated why. Director Klein opened a leather portfolio, extracting papers that she arranged on the table with the precision of someone who'd given this briefing before. "What do you know about cadastral surveying, Dr. Castellanos?" "Property boundary documentation," I said. "Legal descriptions of land parcels, establishing official records of ownership and dimension." "Correct. In the United States, this work falls primarily to county surveyors, with oversight from various state and federal agencies depending on the type of land involved. The system is robust, well-established, generally reliable." She slid a document toward me, a surveyor's plat technical drawing showing property lines and measurements. "This is a standard survey of parcel 447B in Whatcom County, conducted in March of 2019. Routine work, no irregularities noted." The drawing showed an unremarkable rectangle of forested land, approximately 40 acres, bounded by county roads on two sides and private property on the others. Topographical notations indicated gentle slopes, no significant water features, elevation ranging from 820 to 890 feet. 6 months later, Director Klein continued, sliding another document across the table. The same surveyor was asked to recertify the boundaries as part of a property transfer. Standard procedure, but he couldn't complete the work. The second plat was identical to the first in most respects. Same property lines, same measurements. But someone had added annotations in red ink, cramped handwriting that crowded the margins. "Boundary discontinuity observed at any corner. Unable to close polygon. Recommend resurvey with additional crew." The surveyor's report indicated he'd encountered measurement inconsistencies he attributed to equipment malfunction, Director Klein said. A second survey was ordered. Different crew, different equipment. They reported the same issues, though they were somewhat more specific about the nature of the problem. She produced a typed report, official letterhead from a private surveying company. "I'll summarize the relevant section. Transit readings at the northeastern boundary demonstrate persistent angular deviation of approximately 0.7 degrees from expected measurements. Repeated observations with multiple instruments confirm deviation is consistent and reproducible. Unable to determine source of error. Recommend geological survey to identify possible magnetic anomaly." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table. Geological survey found nothing. Magnetic readings were normal, no subsurface features that would affect instrumentation. But by then, word had spread in the surveying community. Whatcom County hired a third firm, specialists in difficult terrain. They spent 4 days on site. "And," I prompted when he paused. "They refused to certify the boundaries. Said the property didn't have consistent dimensions, that measurements varied depending on approach angle and observation point. One of their technicians quit mid-survey. Another filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board, claiming the project was designed to make them falsify data." Director Klein gathered the documents back into her portfolio. "That was when our agency became involved. The Territorial Census Bureau exists, Dr. Castellanos, to document and study geographical anomalies that fall outside conventional surveying and mapping protocols. Locations where standard cartographic methods fail or produce inconsistent results. Places where space itself appears to exhibit properties that violate our understanding of Euclidean geometry. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I'd spent enough time in academia to recognize the careful language of someone presenting an impossible hypothesis, the verbal hedging that preceded claims they knew would be dismissed. "You're describing a non-Euclidean space," I said slowly, "in a forest in Washington state." "We're describing something we don't have adequate vocabulary for," Christopher Webb said, speaking for the first time. His voice was younger than his eyes, which had the exhausted quality of someone who'd seen things they couldn't unknow. "The mathematics suggest non-Euclidean properties, yes, but mathematics is just description, not explanation. We don't know what parcel 447b is. We know what it does, which is resist being accurately mapped." "Over the past 18 months, Director Klein continued, we've conducted extensive documentation of the site. Ground surveys, aerial imagery, LiDAR scanning, satellite observation. Every method produces data, but the data is always inconsistent. The property appears to have different dimensions depending on how you measure it. Not randomly. There are patterns, regularities to the variations, but no single authoritative description." She opened a laptop, turned it so I could see the screen. A three-dimensional model rotated slowly, showing terrain rendered in false color elevation data. At first glance, it looked like standard topographical visualization. Then I noticed how certain sections seemed to curve inward, how valleys appeared deeper when viewed from some angles than others, how the overall shape of the terrain refused to resolve into a coherent whole. "This is compiled from over 200 individual scans," Marcus said. "Each scan is internally consistent, but they don't aggregate into a single model. It's as if each observation describes a slightly different space, all occupying the same coordinates." I stared at the rotating model, watching it shift and reorganize itself as the viewing angle changed. My background in liminal zones had introduced me to the concept of contested space, areas where multiple jurisdictions claimed authority, where maps disagreed depending on who drew them. But those were political constructions, human disagreements about lines on paper. This was something else entirely. "Why me?" I asked. "I'm not a mathematician. I don't work in theoretical physics or whatever field actually deals with this kind of phenomenon." "Because," Director Klein said, closing the laptop, "this isn't primarily a mathematical or physical problem. We have plenty of data. What we need is interpretation, understanding. You've published extensively on the psychological experience of liminal spaces, on how human consciousness responds to geographical ambiguity. We believe parcel 447b isn't just a spatial anomaly, it's a perceptual one. The space itself may be interacting with how it's observed and documented." "You want me to study how people experience this place," I said. "We want you to go there," Christopher Webb corrected. "Tomorrow. Spend time inside the boundary, document your observations, help us understand what it is we're actually dealing with. Others have done this already." A pause. Director Klein and Marcus exchanged a glance that transmitted information I wasn't meant to intercept. "Several of our researchers have conducted extended observations on site," Director Klein said carefully. "Their reports form the basis of our current understanding, but we need fresh perspectives. Someone who hasn't been immersed in our existing theoretical framework, who can approach the phenomenon without preconceptions. What happened to the previous researchers? Another pause, longer this time. Nothing happened to them, Marcus said, but his tone suggested he was answering a different question than I'd asked. They completed their assignments and returned safely, but prolonged exposure to the site appears to have lasting effects. Perceptual disturbances primarily, difficulty with spatial reasoning, problems with navigation and distance estimation. The effects fade over time, usually within a few months. Usually. Always, Director Klein said firmly. Every researcher has returned to baseline cognitive function. Some required longer recovery periods than others, but there's been no permanent damage. I didn't believe her, not entirely. But I'd already accepted the money, signed the NDA, flown across the country. And beneath the growing anxiety was something else, fascination. The idea that space itself could be wrong, that a piece of the world could simply refuse to be measured or known in conventional ways. It was exactly the kind of problem I'd spent my career circling without ever finding. What do you need from me specifically? I asked. 3 weeks on site, Director Klein said. We've established a research station just outside the anomalous boundary. You'll be provided with accommodation, equipment, and support staff. Your task is straightforward documentation. Enter the space, observe, record your experiences. We're particularly interested in phenomenological data, how the space feels, how it affects your perceptual processing, any unusual psychological responses. You're a trained observer of liminal zones. We want you to treat this as an extreme example of geographical ambiguity and tell us what you find. When do I start? Tomorrow morning. We'll drive you to the site, conduct an orientation, ensure you're comfortable with the protocols. Director Klein closed her portfolio. Tonight, you're booked at a hotel in Bellingham. Get rest. What you're about to experience will be taxing in ways that are difficult to anticipate. The meeting concluded with bureaucratic efficiency. Papers to sign, equipment to requisition, safety protocols to review. Christopher Webb would be my primary liaison, the person I'd contact if problems arose. Marcus would remain on site for the first week, available for consultation. Director Klein would return to whatever headquarters the Territorial Census Bureau maintained, receiving regular updates on my progress. I drove back to Bellingham through darkness that felt premature, though my phone showed the time was only 5:30 p.m. The hotel was a mid-range chain property near the waterfront, the kind of place business travelers used and instantly forgot. My room overlooked the harbor, lights from fishing boats reflecting off black water, the bulk of the San Juan Islands invisible in the distance. I couldn't sleep. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching non-Euclidean geometry, theoretical physics, reports of spatial anomalies. The internet offered plenty of conspiracy theories, locations where compasses spun wildly, forests where people got lost despite walking in straight lines, buildings with impossible architecture. But nothing credible, nothing that matched what Director Klein had described with her careful bureaucratic language and legitimate-looking documentation. Around midnight, I received a message on the secure phone. Marcus Ovendell, brief and to the point. Second thoughts are normal, but I should tell you, what we're studying isn't just scientifically significant. It's beautiful, in a terrible sort of way. I think you'll understand tomorrow. I read the message 3 times, trying to extract meaning from his word choice. Beautiful, terrible, understanding. The cartography of absence, I thought, though I didn't know yet what the phrase meant or why it had surfaced in my mind. Just a sense that I was about to learn how empty spaces could have shape, how the unmapped territories between known things could have their own architecture. I didn't sleep well. When I did drift off, I dreamed of maps that rearranged themselves while I watched, boundaries that moved like living things, coordinates that refused to stay fixed. In the dreams, I was always trying to reach a location that shifted further away with each step, distance becoming meaningless, arrival impossible. I woke at dawn with the certainty that I'd made a mistake, that I should call Director Klein and withdraw from the project. But I didn't. Instead, I showered, packed my field bag, and waited in the hotel lobby for the vehicle that would take me to parcel 447B. Christopher Webb arrived at 8:00 a.m. sharp, driving one of the unmarked vans I'd seen at the documentation facility. He looked as tired as I felt, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleep had eluded him too. "Morning," he said, loading my bags into the back. "It's about a 40-minute drive. You'll want coffee." We stopped at a drive-through, acquired terrible drip coffee in paper cups, and headed east into terrain that grew progressively more rural. Christopher drove with the focused competence of someone who'd made this trip many times, navigating unmarked turnoffs and logging roads without consulting GPS. "How long have you been working on this?" I asked. 18 months, since we first identified the anomaly. Before that, I was doing standard survey work, federal land documentation, nothing exciting. Then this came up, and suddenly I'm part of something that probably shouldn't exist. "You sound uncertain about whether you're glad that's the case." He glanced at me, something like appreciation in his expression. "The first time you see it, really see what's happening, there's this moment of pure wonder, like discovering the world is bigger and stranger than you'd imagined. But that feeling doesn't last. What replaces it is more complicated. You start to realize that if this is possible, then maybe a lot of other impossible things are possible too. The universe stops feeling reliable." We turned onto a dirt road that showed recent maintenance, gravel fresh and grading smooth. Forest pressed close on both sides, Douglas fir and western hemlock creating a canopy that filtered sunlight into green dimness. "What should I expect?" I asked. "Honestly, I don't know. Everyone experiences the site differently. Some people report intense spatial disorientation. Others just notice small inconsistencies, distances that feel wrong, directions that don't quite make sense. A few people don't perceive anything unusual at all, which is maybe the most disturbing response because the instrumentation definitely registers the anomaly. But everyone comes back okay." Christopher's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Everyone comes back changed. Whether that constitutes okay is subjective. The physiological effects are temporary. The psychological ones tend to linger. You start questioning your basic perceptual assumptions, doubting your ability to accurately assess your environment. Some researchers have compared it to a very specific form of PTSD, not from trauma exactly, but from having a fundamental certainty violated." The road ended at a cleared area where 3 prefabricated structures had been assembled in a rough triangle. Larger and more permanent than the documentation facility, these buildings suggested long-term occupation. Solar panels covered one roof, and I could see a satellite dish and various antennae sprouting from another. 2 more vehicles were parked nearby, a pickup truck and an ATV. Marcus Ovendell emerged from the largest building as we pulled up, raising a hand in greeting. He looked better here than he had in the fluorescent artificiality of the conference room, as if proximity to the anomaly agreed with him in some fundamental way. "Welcome to Site 7, he said as I climbed out of the van. "Named for being the 7th attempt at establishing a permanent research presence. Previous 6 locations were either inside the boundary, which proved problematic, or too far away to facilitate efficient observation." What made inside the boundary problematic? Equipment failures primarily. Electronics behave unpredictably. Power systems drain faster than they should. Structural integrity becomes questionable. Buildings develop stress fractures. Foundations settle unevenly. We theorize that the spatial distortions affect material consistency over time, though we're still trying to establish causation versus correlation. He led me toward the main building, which turned out to be a combination living quarters and equipment storage. Bunks lined one wall, a kitchenette occupied a corner, and the rest of the space was devoted to monitoring systems and survey equipment. 2 researchers I hadn't met looked up from computer screens as we entered, offered brief nods, returned to their work. "Coffee's always hot," Marcus said, gesturing to an industrial-sized percolator. "Bathroom's functional but temperamental. The water comes from a well and the pressure varies. We've got a generator for primary power, solar panels for backup. Internet is satellite-based, which means slow and weather-dependent. Cell phones don't work out here, but we've got a landline and radio equipment for emergencies." He pulled up a chair at a table covered with maps and printouts. "Before we go any further, I need to make sure you understand the protocols. First and most important, never enter the boundary zone alone. Someone needs to know where you are at all times, and you need to maintain regular contact. We've had instances of people becoming disoriented and unable to find their way back." Define boundary zone. Marcus spread a topographical map on the table, pointing to a highlighted area that roughly corresponded to parcel 447B. "This is the legal property boundary, but the actual anomalous region doesn't conform exactly to the surveyed lines. It's approximately congruent, but the edges are soft, graduated. You don't step from normal space into anomalous space. There's a transition zone maybe 50 to 100 meters wide where effects begin to manifest." "What kind of effects?" "Distance distortion primarily. Paths that should take 10 minutes to walk take 15 or 20, or sometimes 5. Compass readings become unreliable. GPS accuracy degrades. Visual reference points don't align properly with maps. It's subtle at first, easy to dismiss as perceptual error or poor navigation, but instrumentation confirms the discrepancies." He traced a path on the map with his finger. "This is the main access route we've established. Flagged trail, well-maintained, leads from this research station to approximately the center of the anomalous region. Round trip should take about 90 minutes at a normal pace, except it doesn't consistently. Sometimes it's 2 hours, sometimes 70 minutes. The variation doesn't correlate with weather, time of day, or any other variable we've identified." "Today's plan," Christopher said, joining us at the table, "is a basic orientation walk. We'll follow the flagged trail. I'll point out key landmarks. You'll get a sense of the terrain. We're not going deep, just far enough for you to start experiencing the boundary effects. Tomorrow, if you're comfortable, we'll do a more extensive survey." I studied the map, trying to internalize the layout. The anomalous region appeared unremarkable: forested hillside, no significant features, a few seasonal streams marked with dotted lines. but someone had added annotations in what looked like multiple hands, notes clustering in certain areas. Strong distortion zone, temporal drift observed. Subject reported auditory hallucinations. Temporal drift, I asked, pointing to the notation. Marcus hesitated. Some researchers have reported that time feels wrong inside certain areas. Subjective duration doesn't match measured duration. You'll walk for what feels like an hour and your watch shows 30 minutes, or vice versa. We've tried to verify this with synchronized chronometers, but the results have been inconclusive. Because the chronometers malfunction. Because they show different elapsed times despite being synchronized before entry. As if time itself isn't consistent throughout the space. The words should have sounded absurd, the rambling of someone who'd spent too long chasing shadows in the forest. But Marcus spoke with the weary precision of a scientist reporting observations that contradicted his understanding of physical law, trapped between empirical data and theoretical impossibility. We geared up like we were preparing for a serious backcountry expedition, though the map showed we'd be traveling less than a mile from the research station. GPS units, though their utility was questionable. Handheld radios, water and basic first aid supplies. Marcus insisted I carry a personal locator beacon, the kind hikers used in emergency situations, even though he admitted it probably wouldn't work properly inside the anomaly. Protocol, he said when I questioned the redundancy. We prepare for the environment we hope to encounter, not the one we expect. The trailhead was marked with surveyor's tape, bright orange against the green understory. A laminated sign had been zip-tied to a tree trunk. Site 7 research area, authorized personnel only maintain radio contact, report all anomalies. Christopher took the lead, Marcus and I following single file. The path was obvious, well-traveled, climbing gradually through second-growth forest. Sword ferns crowded the understory, and the air smelled of rot and growth in equal measure, that particular Pacific Northwest blend of fecundity and decay. For the first 10 minutes, nothing seemed unusual. We walked, the trail ascended, my legs found their rhythm. Christopher maintained a steady pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a particularly large cedar, an outcrop of moss-covered stone, a seasonal stream bed currently dry. Then gradually, I began to notice inconsistencies. The distance between landmarks felt wrong. We'd pass a distinctive tree, walk for what seemed like 5 minutes, and Christopher would point out another landmark that should have been much farther away. Or we'd climb what appeared to be a gentle slope and arrive at the top winded, as if we'd ascended something much steeper. You're starting to feel it, Marcus said from behind me. Not a question. Distances aren't matching expectations, I confirmed. Try this. He handed me a rangefinder, the kind hunters use to judge shooting distances. Pick an object ahead on the trail, estimate its distance, then measure it. I chose a tree with a distinctive forked trunk, maybe 30 meters ahead. The rangefinder's display showed 47 meters. I lowered the device, looked again at the tree, tried to reconcile the measurement with what my eyes told me. Now walk to it and count your paces, Marcus instructed. I did, 38 paces at my normal stride length, which would put it at roughly 34 meters, closer to my estimate than the rangefinder's measurement, but still not quite right. I turned back, trying to gauge the distance we just covered, and felt the first stirring of genuine disorientation. The space between where I stood and where Marcus and Christopher waited didn't look like 38 paces. It looked simultaneously closer and farther, as if my brain couldn't settle on a single interpretation. Everyone has that moment, Christopher said, watching my face. When the perceptual conflict becomes undeniable, you know intellectually that you just walked a specific distance in a specific number of paces, but the visual information doesn't match the proprioceptive information, and both disagree with the instrumentation. We continued up the trail, and the effects intensified. Not dramatically. There was no sudden transition into impossible space, but through accumulation. Each small discrepancy built on the previous ones until I found myself unable to trust my basic sense of where I was in relation to where I'd been. The flagging tape along the trail helped. Orange strips tied at regular intervals, providing visual anchors. Except after a while, I noticed the intervals weren't actually regular. Sometimes 3 flags would cluster close together. Sometimes a gap would seem to go on forever before the next marker appeared. Is the flagging inconsistent? I asked. Or is my perception of it inconsistent? Yes, Marcus said simply. We reached a small clearing where someone had installed a weather station, solar-powered anemometer, precipitation gauge, temperature sensors. Christopher checked the readings on a small display, noted them in a waterproof notebook he carried. Interesting, he murmured. What? Temperature gradient. It's reading 3.7 degrees cooler here than at the research station, but we've only gained about 40 meters of elevation. Should be maybe a degree of temperature drop, not nearly 4. Microclimate variation, I suggested. Possibly, except the temperature at this exact spot varies between visits. Last time I was here, it was actually warmer than the base station. We sat on logs someone had arranged in a rough circle, drinking water and resting. The forest around us looked completely ordinary. Douglas fir canopy, understory of ferns and salal, the occasional bird call. Nothing suggested we were in a space where physical laws behaved strangely. Tell me about the people who have studied this before me, I said. What did they conclude? Marcus and Christopher exchanged glances again. That same information-transmitting look I'd seen at the documentation facility. The first researcher was a physicist, Marcus began. Dr. Helen Corrigan. She approached it as a problem in field theory, hypothesizing some kind of localized space-time distortion. Spent 6 weeks here, collected enormous amounts of data, started developing mathematical models of the phenomenon. Her final report concluded that the space exhibited properties consistent with certain solutions to Einstein's field equations, essentially treating the area as a mild gravitational anomaly. And 3 months after leaving the site, she had a complete breakdown. Started claiming that all spaces were like this. That consistent geometry was an illusion we imposed on fundamentally inconsistent reality. She was hospitalized, treated for what was diagnosed as stress-induced psychosis. She recovered mostly, but refuses to discuss the project or her experiences here. The words settled heavily in the clearing. I watched sunlight pattern the forest floor, trying to process what I just heard. The second researcher, Christopher continued, was an anthropologist, Dr. James Mendoza. He theorized the phenomenon might be perceptual rather than physical, that something about the space triggered unusual cognitive responses in observers. He interviewed all the surveyors who'd reported problems, did extensive psychological assessments, tried to find commonalities in how people experienced the anomaly. His conclusion was that the space functioned as a kind of psychological boundary zone, a place where the brain's spatial processing systems received contradictory inputs and essentially gave up trying to maintain a coherent model. Did he also have a breakdown? No, but he developed severe agoraphobia after leaving. Couldn't enter unfamiliar spaces without experiencing panic attacks. Last I heard, he was doing remote work from his apartment, hadn't been outside in over a year. I stared at Marcus, and you brought me here anyway, knowing that your previous researchers were psychologically damaged by exposure to this place. They were damaged by prolonged exposure, Marcus corrected, and by approaching the phenomenon with rigid theoretical frameworks that couldn't accommodate what they were experiencing. Dr. Corrigan tried to reduce it to physics equations. Dr. Mendoza tried to reduce it to cognitive psychology. Both failed because they were trying to make the anomaly fit their disciplines rather than accepting it on its own terms. What makes you think I'll do better? Because your discipline is about ambiguity, he said. You study liminal zones, contested spaces, areas where boundaries are inherently uncertain. You're intellectually prepared for a phenomenon that resists definitive explanation. And because we're not asking you to explain it, just to experience it and document what you observe. It was thin comfort, but I'd come too far to retreat now. We finished our water, gathered our equipment, and continued up the trail. The forest gradually changed character. Not dramatically, no sudden shift from one ecosystem to another, but through subtle alterations I couldn't quite articulate. The trees seemed to lean at angles that bothered my sense of vertical. Spaces between trunks created sightlines that my eyes couldn't quite follow to their conclusion. The quality of light shifted in ways that had nothing to do with canopy density or time of day. After what my watch claimed was another 15 minutes but felt like either 5 or 30, we reached a second clearing. This one was larger, perhaps 50 meters across, roughly circular. At its center stood a cairn, stacked stones forming a pyramid maybe 4 feet tall. This is approximately the geometric center of the anomalous region, Marcus said. Though center is a problematic concept when dealing with non-Euclidean space, but various methods of estimation all converge on this general location. The cairn was clearly constructed, stones deliberately chosen and placed. Moss covered the lower courses, suggesting it had been here for years, possibly decades. Who built it? I asked. We don't know. It predates our research program. Best guess is someone associated with the original land survey, maybe as a benchmark or reference point. But there's no documentation in any historical records we've accessed. I approached the cairn slowly, studying its construction. The stones fit together with surprising precision, each one supporting those above it in a structure that looked both intentional and ancient. Some of the rocks showed tool marks, chisel scars suggesting they'd been shaped to fit. As I circled the cairn, I experienced a sensation I'd never felt before and couldn't adequately describe. It was as if the space around the stone pile was simultaneously expanding and contracting, breathing with a rhythm I could sense but not hear. Distance became subjective. The cairn appeared to be both close enough to touch and impossibly far away, the conflicting perceptions existing simultaneously without resolving. "Don't touch it," Christopher said sharply. I pulled my hand back, realizing I'd been reaching toward the stones without conscious intention. Why not? Contact seems to intensify the perceptual effects. We've had people touch the cairn and report severe spatial disorientation lasting for hours. One researcher claimed the stones were warm, almost hot. Another said they were ice cold. Temperature measurements showed them at ambient air temperature, but subjective experience varied dramatically. I stepped back from the cairn, and the breathing sensation faded slightly. My radio crackled with static, brief burst of white noise that resolved into silence. Interference is common here, Marcus said. Electronics don't fail catastrophically, but they behave unpredictably. Batteries drain faster than they should. Signals degrade. Digital recordings develop artifacts, sounds that weren't present during capture, visual distortions in video footage. We spent another 20 minutes in the clearing, while Marcus and Christopher took measurements, documented conditions, recorded observations in their respective notebooks. I found myself unable to look directly at the cairn for more than a few seconds at a time, not because it was disturbing exactly, but because sustained focus on it created a sense of vertigo, as if the structure existed in more dimensions than my visual cortex could process. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, studying my face with clinical attention. "Disoriented, not sick, just uncertain, like I can't quite trust my senses." "That's normal. The effect is cumulative. The longer you spend inside the boundary, the more pronounced it becomes. But it also plateaus after a certain point. You don't spiral into complete perceptual breakdown. You reach a new equilibrium where the distortions feel almost normal." Almost. You never fully adapt. There's always a background sense of wrongness. But your brain learns to function despite it, the same way it learns to function despite blind spots in your visual field or the constant motion of your head. Perceptual systems are remarkably flexible when they have to be. We began the return journey, following the flagged trail back toward the research station. The descent should have been faster than the climb, but it wasn't. Time seemed to dilate and compress unpredictably. A section of trail I remembered walking for 10 minutes outbound took either 3 or 20 minutes to traverse in reverse. I couldn't tell which, my watch and my subjective sense of duration failing to achieve any consensus. By the time we emerged from the forest near the research station, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Mental fatigue, cognitive strain from trying to maintain spatial awareness in an environment where space itself was unreliable. My head ached with a dull pressure behind my eyes, and I felt slightly nauseated, as if suffering from mild motion sickness. "That's typical," Christopher said, seeing my condition. "First exposure is always the hardest. Your brain is working overtime trying to reconcile contradictory inputs. It gets easier. Or you get worse at noticing," Marcus added with a humor that didn't quite reach his eyes. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the research station, reviewing data from previous surveys, studying maps and models that all failed to capture the phenomenon they were attempting to document. The other researchers, a graduate student named Kaitlin and a technician named Jerome, moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of people who'd been here too long, speaking in shorthand about the gradient and temporal drift coefficients and perceptual loading factors. Dinner was communal, eaten around a folding table while rain began to pattern the roof with increasing intensity. The conversation was deliberately normal, talk of weather patterns, logistics, supply runs, anything but the actual work we were engaged in. I recognized it as a coping mechanism, a way of maintaining sanity by refusing to obsess over the impossible thing that surrounded us. That night, in a bunk that smelled faintly of mildew and previous occupants, I lay awake listening to the forest. Rain, wind in the canopy, the occasional crack of a branch. Normal sounds. But beneath them, or perhaps woven through them, I thought I could detect something else. A rhythm that didn't correspond to any natural cycle. A pattern that existed just beyond the threshold of perception. I dreamed again of maps, but this time they were maps of nothing. Blank spaces that nonetheless conveyed information. Absence that had shape and weight. In the dreams, I was trying to document a place that existed only in the gaps between real locations, a territory defined entirely by what it wasn't. The next 3 days established a routine. Morning entry into the boundary zone, 6 to 8 hours of observation and documentation, evening review and data organization. I carried recording equipment, cameras, audio recorders, GPS trackers, even though we knew the data would be compromised. The point wasn't to create reliable technical documentation, but to capture subjective experience, to build a phenomenological database of how the space felt to different observers. I discovered that the anomaly had moods, or what I came to think of as moods. Some days the distortions were subtle, easily overlooked if you weren't paying attention. Other days the space seemed to actively resist being navigated, paths looping back on themselves, landmarks appearing in wrong locations, distance becoming purely notional. On the 4th day, I went alone into the boundary zone for the first time. Marcus had argued against it, but Christopher supported the idea, saying that solo observation often produced insights that paired surveys missed. I followed the flagged trail to the cairn, spent an hour sitting in the clearing, trying to empty my mind of expectations and simply perceive. The quality of attention required was exhausting. I had to hold myself in a state of receptive awareness, noting everything without trying to interpret or categorize. The angle of sunlight through the canopy, the pattern of moss on tree trunks, the spacing of flagging tape along the trail. The cairn itself, standing at the clearing's center like a monument to something I couldn't name. And slowly, I began to sense the architecture. Not see it exactly, but perceive it the way you might perceive the presence of a person standing behind you in a dark room. The space had structure, but it was structure that existed in dimensions my senses couldn't directly access. I felt it as pressure, as subtle gradients of wrongness, as areas where the air itself seemed thicker or thinner than it should be. I'd brought a notebook, and I tried to sketch what I was perceiving. Not maps were inadequate to this task, but something more like emotional cartography. I drew lines and curves that represented not distance but intensity of experience. Shaded areas not to indicate elevation but to show zones of perceptual loading. Created a key that translated traditional cartographic symbols into phenomenological equivalents. Contour lines of increasing disorientation, zones of temporal uncertainty, ridges of maximum spatial distortion. The result looked like nothing that would be recognized as a map. It looked more like abstract art, like a psychological diagram, like the visual representation of a migraine aura. But it felt true in a way that conventional mapping didn't. It captured something essential about how the space actually functioned, even if it sacrificed all pretense of objective measurement. I was so absorbed in the work that I didn't notice how much time had passed until the light began to change. My watch showed 4:47 p.m., but the quality of illumination suggested either earlier or later. I stood, knees protesting after hours of sitting, and began the return journey to the research station. The trail looked different. Not dramatically so. The flagging was still present, the landmarks recognizable. But something about the spacing felt off. I walked for what seemed like the appropriate duration but didn't arrive at familiar points. Turned around, tried to reorient, found myself at a section of trail I didn't remember passing. The first flutter of panic touched my chest. I stopped, forced myself to breathe slowly, assessed my situation rationally. I had GPS, though its reliability was questionable. Radio, though the transmission might be garbled. And I was on a well-marked trail that couldn't be more than a mile from the research station, even if distances weren't behaving consistently. I tried the radio. This is Vera. I'm on my way back from the cairn, but I'm having trouble with navigation. Can anyone provide guidance? Static, then Christopher's voice, distorted but comprehensible. Copy that, Vera. We're reading your GPS signal, but it's showing you about 200 meters northwest of where you should be if you're on the flagged trail. Can you describe your immediate surroundings? I looked around. Forest, understory, no distinguishing features. I'm on what looks like the main trail. Recent flagging visible both directions, but I don't recognize this section. Okay, that's consistent with what we're seeing. You might be on a parallel track. We've documented instances where paths seem to branch or double without clear divergence points. Try following the trail uphill. The research station is at lower elevation than the cairn, so if you're gaining elevation, you're heading the wrong direction. I checked my compass, but it was spinning slowly, unable to settle on a bearing. The terrain around me appeared level, but my inner ear suggested a gentle downward slope. I trusted proprioception over visual assessment and began walking in what felt like the downhill direction. The trail continued, flagging regular, but everything felt subtly wrong. Trees leaned at angles that bothered my sense of balance. Spaces between landmarks stretched and compressed. At one point, I saw the research station through the trees, clearly visible, maybe 100 meters ahead, and walked toward it for 15 minutes without getting noticeably closer. The panic was no longer just a flutter. My chest felt tight, breathing shallow, that particular flavor of fear that comes from losing faith in your ability to navigate your environment. I stopped again, forced myself to sit, to calm down. Panic would only make the situation worse. The radio crackled. Vera, we've lost your GPS signal. Your last known position was approximately 300 meters northeast of the research station, but that was 5 minutes ago. Can you provide an update? I can see the building, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Or I think I can, through the trees to my south-southwest, but I can't seem to reach it. A pause, then Marcus's voice. That's not unusual. Visual sightlines don't always correspond to actual proximity inside the boundary. I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are. Keep talking on the radio so I can get a bearing on your transmission. Roger that. I'm sitting on a fallen log, distinctive moss pattern, about 20 meters west of what appears to be the flagged trail. Keep describing your surroundings. Any detail helps. I talked for what felt like 20 minutes, describing the forest around me in exhaustive detail, the species of trees, the density of understory, the pattern of light and shadow. Marcus's voice periodically responded, asking clarifying questions, telling me he was getting closer. Then, with no fanfare or obvious transition, he was there, just suddenly present, emerging from the forest, not from the direction I'd expected, but from an angle that made no geometric sense given where the research station should have been. "You okay?" he asked, studying my face. "Disoriented, a little scared, but physically fine." "That's good. This is one of the more disconcerting aspects of the anomaly, the way it can prevent you from reaching a destination you can clearly see. We call it destination resistance. The space seems to actively redirect you away from your intended goal." "Why didn't you warn me this might happen?" "Would it have helped? Would knowing that the phenomenon exists have made it less distressing to experience?" I didn't answer. We walked back together, and with Marcus leading, the journey took maybe 10 minutes. The research station appeared gradually rather than suddenly, resolving out of the forest as if it had been there all along, and I simply hadn't noticed. That night, I wrote in my journal, personal observations separate from the official documentation I was compiling for the agency. I described the sensation of destination resistance, the psychological impact of seeing a place, but being unable to reach it. I theorized that the space didn't just distort distance, but somehow made itself resistant to intentional navigation, as if the act of trying to reach a specific location caused the path to fold away from your destination. Over the following days, I tested this hypothesis. I found that aimless wandering was relatively easy. You could traverse the boundary zone without much difficulty if you had no particular goal. But the moment you tried to reach a specific landmark or return to a previous location, the space became labyrinthine. Paths multiplied, doubled back on themselves, led in circles that didn't quite close. I documented this in my strange phenomenological maps, creating symbols for zones of high destination resistance and paths of least navigational interference. The resulting cartography looked nothing like traditional surveying, but it captured something true about how the space functioned experientially. On the 7th day, I decided to try something different. Instead of entering the boundary zone with the intention of observing it, I tried to enter without intention, to simply walk without destination or purpose, letting the space guide me rather than imposing my will upon it. Christopher thought this was a terrible idea. That's how people get lost, seriously lost. We've had to conduct extensive searches for researchers who went with the flow and couldn't find their way back. But Marcus was intrigued. It's actually theoretically sound. If destination resistance is a function of the observer's intentional state, then removing intention might reduce resistance. But you need to maintain some anchor to the research station. Here, he gave me a spool of high tensile cord. Play it out behind you as you walk. If you get genuinely lost, you can follow it back. I attached one end of the cord to a tree near the trailhead and began walking with the spool in hand, letting the line unspool behind me. I deliberately avoided looking at my GPS, avoided checking my compass, avoided trying to maintain any sense of direction or progress toward a goal. I just walked, following whatever path felt most natural, turning when turning felt right. The experience was profoundly disorienting and strangely liberating. Without the cognitive load of trying to navigate, I could pay attention to other aspects of the space. The way light moved through the canopy in patterns that didn't quite match the wind. The sound of water that had no visible source. The presence of the cairn, which I could sense even when I couldn't see it, like a gravitational center around which everything else orbited. I walked for what might have been hours, the cord spooling out behind me. I didn't consciously aim for the cairn, but eventually I found myself in its clearing anyway, approaching from an angle I'd never used before. The stone structure stood exactly as it always did, yet somehow different, as if I was seeing it without the filter of expectation, perceiving it as it actually existed rather than as I anticipated it would be. I sat beside the cairn, close enough to touch but not touching, and for the first time since arriving at the site, I felt I understood something fundamental about the space. It wasn't broken. It wasn't malfunctioning. The anomaly wasn't a glitch in reality or a failure of physical law. It was simply organized according to principles that had nothing to do with human concepts of distance, direction, or Euclidean geometry. It had its own internal consistency, its own logic, its own form of spatial architecture. The problem wasn't the space. It was our methods of perceiving and documenting it. We were trying to map territory using tools designed for a completely different kind of geography. It was like trying to measure temperature with a ruler or weigh sound on a scale. The measurements failed not because temperature and sound didn't exist, but because we were using fundamentally inappropriate instruments. I stood, examined the cairn from multiple angles, and realized I could see the structure now. Not physically see it. The stones remained stones, visually unchanged, but perceived the architecture of absence that surrounded and penetrated them. The cairn was a marker, yes, but not in the way we'd assumed. It wasn't marking the center of the anomaly. It was marking the point where the anomaly's architecture became most legible, where the underlying structure pressed closest to the surface of normal space. I spent another unmeasured duration in the clearing, trying to capture this understanding in words and sketches. Then I followed the cord back, hand over hand, letting it lead me out of the boundary zone. The return journey was effortless, suggesting that Marcus's theory had been correct. Removing intentionality reduced destination resistance. I emerged from the forest as the sun was setting, the research station illuminated by generator-powered lights that looked harsh and artificial against the gathering darkness. Christopher was standing by the trail head, clearly relieved to see me. 6 hours, he said. You were in there for 6 hours. We were getting worried. It felt like 2, I said. Maybe 3. Your cord ran out almost a kilometer back. You tied knots to extend it. Do you remember doing that? I didn't. I had no memory of the cord running short or of finding additional line to extend it. But when I pulled the spool back, sure enough, there were crude knots every 100 meters or so, places where I'd apparently tied on additional segments of rope I'd found or fashioned somehow. That night's debriefing was extensive. Marcus wanted to know every detail of my experience, particularly my impression of the cairn and my sense of the space's underlying structure. I tried to articulate what I'd perceived, but the vocabulary felt inadequate. I kept resorting to metaphor, talking about architecture of absence, about negative space having positive properties, about geography organized by principles we didn't have mathematics to describe. You're describing it the way Corrigan did, Marcus said quietly. Before she broke, she kept talking about how the space was perfectly consistent, just consistent according to rules we didn't understand. She said our failure to perceive the pattern didn't mean there was no pattern. What if she was right? I asked. What if she didn't break because she was wrong, but because she was right and couldn't handle the implications? Marcus didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weariness I hadn't heard before. Then we're all going to break eventually. Because if this place represents genuine non-Euclidean space existing within our otherwise normal geometry, then either physics is fundamentally broken, or we've discovered something that physics can't currently account for. Either option is existentially terrifying for people who have built their lives on the assumption that reality follows consistent rules. I slept poorly that night, dreaming of the cairn. In the dreams, I could see its true structure, not the stacked stones but the framework of absence they marked. It extended in directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space, connecting to other cairns in other locations, forming a network of reference points for a geography that human perception couldn't directly access. The second week proceeded with increasing intensity. I developed a routine of entering the boundary zone in the morning, spending 4 to 6 hours observing and documenting, returning to the research station to compile notes and refine my phenomenological maps. The maps grew increasingly complex and increasingly strange, abandoning all pretense of conventional cartographic representation in favor of diagrams that captured experiential truth at the cost of visual coherence. Kaitlin, the graduate student, studied my maps with an expression I couldn't quite read, part fascination, part concern. "These look like neural network diagrams," she said. "Or maybe mystical symbols. They don't look like maps." "They're not maps of physical space," I explained. "They're maps of perceptual experience. They show not where things are but how they feel to be located relative to each other." "That's not geography." "Maybe geography, as we've defined it, is too narrow. Maybe there are forms of spatial organization that require new cartographic methods." She looked at me the way you might look at someone exhibiting early symptoms of illness. I recognized the expression. It was probably how people had looked at Dr. Corrigan before she'd fully broken, when she'd started saying things that sounded almost reasonable but carried the taint of fundamental wrongness. On the 10th day, I made my deepest penetration into the boundary zone yet, moving past the cairn into regions no one had extensively documented. The flagged trail ended at the cairn, but I continued beyond it, marking my path with surveyor's tape from a roll I'd brought specifically for this purpose. The forest changed character beyond the cairn, though I couldn't articulate exactly how. The trees were the same species, the understory the same mix of ferns and brush, but the space itself felt different, more resistant, more actively strange. Each step required conscious effort, as if I was moving through a medium denser than air. I found another cairn, smaller than the first, constructed from darker stones, but clearly artificial. No mention of this structure existed in any of the documentation I'd reviewed. Either previous researchers hadn't ventured this far, or they hadn't reported what they'd found. I approached carefully, noting how the space around this cairn felt even more compressed than around the first. It was like approaching a black hole. Not that gravity increased, but that something about the geometry created pressure, made forward progress difficult. The stones of this second cairn were carved, not extensively, just small marks, symbols that might have been letters in an unfamiliar alphabet or might have been purely decorative. I photographed them from multiple angles, knowing the images probably wouldn't come out clearly but creating documentation anyway. Behind the second cairn, the forest opened into something I couldn't immediately classify. Not quite a clearing, trees grew throughout it, but a space where the understory was absent, where nothing grew below the canopy except moss. The ground was irregular, rising and falling in wave-like patterns that suggested geology, but didn't match any geological formation I knew. I walked into this space, and the disorientation intensified dramatically. The pressure I'd been feeling magnified until it felt like I was moving through water, each step requiring effort. Sound behaved strangely, my footfalls producing echoes that arrived too early or too late, as if distance and time were no longer properly synchronized. At what I judged to be the approximate center of this cleared space stood a third cairn. This one was different from the others, taller, narrower, constructed from stones so perfectly fitted they required no mortar or chinking. It looked ancient in a way that had nothing to do with visible wear or moss coverage. It looked ancient the way certain rock formations look ancient, as if it had been there since before human time and would remain long after. I didn't approach this cairn. Some instinct warned me that getting too close would be dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. Instead, I sat at what felt like a safe distance and observed. The air around the third cairn was wrong. Not visibly. There was no shimmer or distortion, no obvious visual cue. But my eyes couldn't quite focus on the space immediately adjacent to the stones. It was like trying to look at something in your peripheral vision. The harder you tried to see it directly, the more it slipped away from clear perception. I took measurements with the instruments I'd brought, though I knew they'd be unreliable. Temperature showed as oscillating rapidly between 52 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, changing second by second despite no apparent environmental cause. Magnetic readings were chaotic, the compass needle spinning continuously. GPS signal was completely lost, showing no satellite acquisition despite clear sky above the canopy. I tried to make another of my phenomenological maps, but found I couldn't. My hands wouldn't cooperate pencil-making marks that didn't correspond to intended movements. I attempted 3 times to sketch the space, and each time produced nothing but random scribbles, as if the fine motor control required for drawing had been compromised. That's when I noticed the silence, complete absence of ambient sound, no wind, no birds, no insects, not even the whisper of my own breathing. The silence was so profound it became its own form of noise, a pressure in my ears like being deep underwater. I stood to leave and discovered I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. The space around me looked uniform in all directions, no distinguishing features, no obvious path. The surveyor's tape I'd been using to mark my route was visible, bright orange against the forest floor, but the trail it marked seemed to lead in multiple directions simultaneously, each length of tape pointing toward a different exit. Fear arrived then, not the flutter of earlier disorientation, but full-bodied terror. I was lost in a way that had nothing to do with not knowing my location, and everything to do with location itself becoming meaningless. The concept of direction had dissolved, leaving me stranded in a space where movement in any particular trajectory was impossible because trajectories themselves didn't exist. I tried the radio, but it produced only static. Tried my phone, which shouldn't have had signal but might have stored map data, and found it completely dead despite being fully charged when I'd entered the boundary. Breathe, I told myself. Think rationally. You're not far from the cairn, which means you're not far from the flagged trail, which means you're maybe 2 miles from the research station. They know you're out here. They'll come looking if you don't return by nightfall. But how would they find me if I couldn't be reached by conventional navigation? If destination resistance was this strong, if the space was actively preventing directed movement, how could anyone reach me deliberately? I sat back down, forcing myself to stay calm, to think through the problem methodically. The cord trick had worked before, following a physical tether out of the boundary zone. But I hadn't brought cord on this trip, hadn't anticipated needing it. The surveyor's tape. I'd been marking my path with tape, which meant I'd created a physical trail of breadcrumbs leading back the way I'd come. I stood, selected one of the directions the tape indicated, and began walking, paying out more tape behind me as I went. The path led through forest that looked simultaneously familiar and alien. I recognized individual trees, remembered passing specific landmarks, but they were arranged in configurations that didn't match my memory of the route. It was as if the components of the journey were all present but had been reorganized according to some principle I didn't understand. I walked for what felt like hours, following the tape trail, which occasionally branched or doubled back on itself in ways that made no geometric sense. At one point, I found myself back at the third cairn, approaching from a different angle, despite having walked consistently in one direction. This time, I didn't sit. I selected a different tape trail and followed it with determination, refusing to look back at the cairn, refusing to acknowledge the impossible geometry that kept redirecting me. And eventually, through persistence or luck or some quality of the space itself deciding to release me, I found the second cairn, and beyond it the first, and beyond that the flagged trail leading back to the research station. I emerged from the boundary zone as full darkness fell, exhausted beyond anything physical exertion could account for. Christopher was waiting at the trailhead with a flashlight and an expression of profound relief. 12 hours, he said. You've been in there for 12 hours. We were about to organize a search party. It felt like 4, I said, maybe 6. Marcus appeared from the research station, moving quickly despite the darkness. What happened? Your GPS signal disappeared completely around noon. We've been trying to raise you on radio for hours. I told them about the second and third cairns, about the space beyond where direction stopped functioning, about the tape trail that kept looping back on itself. Marcus listened with an intensity that bordered on hunger, occasionally stopping me to ask for clarification or additional detail. No one's reported a third cairn before, he said when I'd finished. Or if they have, it wasn't included in the documentation I've seen. This is significant, Vieira. You've penetrated deeper into the anomaly than anyone since the initial surveys. It nearly killed me, I said flatly. I couldn't navigate, couldn't find my way out. If I hadn't been marking the trail with tape, I'd still be lost in there. But you did find your way out, which suggests the space isn't uniformly hostile to navigation. It just requires approaches we haven't fully developed yet. I wanted to argue with him, to point out that surviving by luck wasn't the same as having a reliable method. But I was too tired, too cognitively drained to form coherent arguments. I ate mechanically, showered in the temperamental bathroom, and collapsed into my bunk. That night I had the clearest of the dreams. I saw the network of cairns, not just the 3 I'd physically encountered, but dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spread across a geography that bore no relationship to the physical terrain of Whatcom County. They formed a structure, a framework that existed in dimensions perpendicular to normal space. And through this framework moved something I could only describe as awareness, not consciousness exactly, but a form of attention that observed and categorized and remembered. The boundary zone wasn't a place. It was a sense organ, a perceptual apparatus belonging to something vast and incomprehensible, using the cairns as reference points to map territories that human consciousness couldn't directly perceive. I woke with this understanding fully formed, as if it had been downloaded into my sleeping mind. And with it came certainty. Continuing this research was dangerous not because the space might harm me physically, but because sustained exposure to it would fundamentally alter how I perceived reality. Like Dr. Corrigan, I would start to see this pattern everywhere, recognize the architecture of absence underlying all geography, understand that consistent Euclidean space was the exception rather than the rule. At breakfast, I told Marcus I needed to leave. Not immediately. I'd honor the commitment I'd made, finish the 3-week term, but I wouldn't be extending my stay or continuing the research long term. He nodded slowly, unsurprised. You've seen something that changed how you understand the world. That's the threshold moment. Some people retreat from it, preserve their conventional worldview by refusing to fully integrate what they've experienced. Others, like Dr. Corrigan, dive in completely and get lost in the implications. "What did you do?" I asked. "I'm still here," he said simply, "studying something I know will eventually break my mind but can't bring myself to walk away from. That's its own form of madness, I suppose. The madness of curiosity overwhelming survival instinct." The final week was the longest. I continued my documentation, refined my phenomenological maps, wrote extensive reports describing the perceptual effects of different zones within the boundary. But I was careful now, deliberate about not penetrating too deep, not getting lost in the implications of what I was observing. I returned to the first cairn daily, sat in the clearing, tried to perceive the underlying structure without letting myself be consumed by it. It was like trying to look at the sun. You had to approach obliquely, take quick glimpses rather than sustained observation, protect yourself from the full intensity of what you were attempting to perceive. On my next to last day, I made a final trip to the second cairn. I didn't venture beyond it, had no desire to encounter the third cairn again or the space where direction dissolved into meaninglessness. Instead, I studied the carved symbols more carefully, trying to determine if they were linguistic or decorative or something else entirely. They looked worn, not from weather but from time itself. Edges that had once been sharp had been rounded by centuries or millennia of existence. The stone was basalt, dark and fine-grained, harder than the surrounding granite bedrock. Someone had transported these stones here deliberately, chosen them for specific properties, carved them with intention. I photographed the symbols extensively, knowing the images probably wouldn't capture what I was seeing but creating documentation anyway. Then I did something that surprised me. I reached out and touched the cairn, pressed my palm against one of the carved stones. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Not physical. The stone felt like stone, cool and slightly rough, but perceptual. For just an instant, I could see the network. Not metaphorically or imaginatively, but actually perceive the framework of cairns and the attention that moved through them. I saw spaces that didn't exist in conventional geography, territories organized according to principles that had nothing to do with distance or direction or physical proximity. And I understood that the boundary zone wasn't unique. It was just the most obvious example, the place where the underlying pattern pressed closest to the surface of normal space. But that pattern was everywhere, woven through all geography, a substrate of impossible architecture supporting the visible world. I pulled my hand back, gasping, heart racing. The vision collapsed, leaving me with only echoes, a sense memory of having perceived something vast and intricate and fundamentally incompatible with human consciousness. I marked the location carefully on my maps, noted the experience in my documentation, and returned to the research station. I didn't tell Marcus or Christopher what I'd seen. Some knowledge felt too dangerous to share, too likely to push them across whatever threshold they were currently balanced on. My last night at Site 7, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk listening to the forest, feeling the presence of the boundary zone like pressure against my consciousness. It was out there, just beyond the walls of the research station, doing whatever it did when no human was observing it, existing in its own strange geometry, mapping territories we couldn't perceive, serving purposes we couldn't imagine. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went outside. The forest was dark under heavy cloud cover, but I could feel the cairn out there in the blackness, could sense its position not through sight or any conventional sense, but through the same impossible perception that let me feel the architecture of absence. Christopher found me standing in the darkness, staring into the forest. "Can't sleep." "Can you?" I asked. "Not well, not anymore. The pattern's too loud now. I keep feeling it even when I'm away from the site. It's like once you learn to perceive it, you can't unlearn. It's always there, always pressing at the edges of your awareness." We stood in silence for a while, two people who'd seen something that couldn't be unseen, carrying knowledge that couldn't be safely integrated or comfortably discarded. "What will you do?" Christopher finally asked. "After you leave?" "Go home, try to resume my normal life, pretend I never came here." "Do you think that will work?" "No," I admitted, "but I'll try anyway, because the alternative is accepting that everything I thought I understood about how space functions is wrong, and I'm not ready to live in that world." "None of us are," Christopher said quietly, "but we're living in it anyway." The drive out the next morning was surreal, Christopher taking me back to Bellingham, retracing the route we'd taken 3 weeks earlier. The forest looked different now, charged with implications I couldn't name. I kept seeing potential cairns in rock formations, patterns in tree placement that might have been significant or might have been random, spaces between spaces that hinted at deeper architecture. At the airport, Christopher handed me a sealed envelope. "Your payment, plus copies of the reports you compiled, and this." He pressed a business card into my hand. "That's my personal number, not the project line. If you need to talk to someone who understands what you experienced, call me. Any time, day or night. Because trust me, you're going to need to talk about it eventually." I flew home in a daze, processing back into my ordinary life like an astronaut returning from orbit, trying to readjust to normal gravity. My apartment looked exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different somehow. Less solid, less permanent, as if it was just one possible configuration of space rather than a fixed and stable location. I tried to resume my regular work, teaching, research, the comfortable routines of academic life, but I couldn't focus on conventional geography anymore. Looking at standard maps felt like looking at children's drawings, crude approximations that missed everything important. I knew there was deeper structure beneath the representations, architecture that conventional cartography couldn't capture. After 2 weeks of trying and failing to return to normal, I contacted Marcus. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting for my call. "It doesn't go away, does it?" I said without preamble. "No," he confirmed. "You can suppress it, distract yourself, try to convince yourself it was an anomaly or hallucination. But you always know the truth. You've seen the pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it." "What do I do?" That's up to you. Some people build lives around avoiding the implications. They change careers, move to urban centers where natural space is minimal, surround themselves with human construction and artificial geometry. Others lean into it, become researchers like me, spend their lives studying what they know will eventually break them. Is there a middle path? A long pause. I don't know. If there is, I haven't found it, but maybe you will. You're better at living with ambiguity than most people. That's why we chose you. I hung up and sat for a long time, staring at my wall where I'd pinned the phenomenological maps I'd created. They looked insane, diagrams that no cartographer would recognize, symbols that meant nothing to conventional geography. But they were true in a way that ordinary maps couldn't be. They captured something essential about how space actually functioned when you stripped away human assumptions about distance and direction. Elena called 3 days later. We hadn't spoken since she'd left, and hearing her voice created a complicated tangle of emotions I wasn't prepared to process. "I heard you took a consulting job," she said. "How did it go?" "It was complicated. I can't really talk about the details. NDA." "You sound different, distant." "I saw something that changed how I understand the world," I said, the most honest answer I could give. "And I'm having trouble integrating it with my previous understanding of how things work." "That's always been your problem, Vera. You think too much. You can't just experience things. You have to understand them, categorize them, fit them into frameworks. Sometimes reality doesn't fit into neat academic boxes." She was right, but not in the way she thought. The problem wasn't that I was forcing reality into boxes it didn't fit. The problem was that I discovered the boxes themselves were illusions, that the frameworks I'd spent my career building were approximations of something far stranger and more complex. We talked for another 20 minutes, careful conversation that avoided the real issues between us. When we hung up, I felt even more isolated than before. There was no one I could talk to about what I'd experienced, no one who would understand without having been there themselves. That night I dreamed of the third cairn again, but this time, instead of observing it from a distance, I approached, walked right up to it, placed both hands on the stones, and let myself fully perceive the network it was part of. The vision was overwhelming. I saw not just parcel 447B, but hundreds of other locations, scattered across the globe, each one a point where the underlying architecture pressed close to the surface. Some were natural features, caves, mountain peaks, valleys that had never been properly mapped. Others were human constructions, places where ancient builders had somehow intuited the pattern and built structures that aligned with it. And I understood that the cairns weren't markers for human benefit. They were anchor points, places where the attention that moved through the network could interface with physical reality. The spaces weren't studying us. They were studying through us, using human consciousness as a kind of sensor array to perceive and map territories that existed in dimensions we couldn't directly access. I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I just glimpsed something I was never meant to see. Not forbidden exactly. There was no malice or intent to the pattern, but simply beyond the processing capacity of human consciousness. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I tried to teach, standing in front of classrooms talking about cartographic methods and spatial analysis, while knowing that everything I was saying was fundamentally inadequate. I tried to research, reading papers and attending conferences where colleagues discussed geography using frameworks that I now recognized as beautiful but incomplete. I started noticing the pattern everywhere, not as dramatically as in the boundary zone, but as subtle wrongness woven through ordinary space, distances that didn't quite add up, directions that shifted depending on approach angle, places where the geometry seemed slightly off in ways that conventional measurement couldn't capture. At first, I thought I was going mad, seeing patterns that didn't exist, projecting my parcel 447b experience onto normal geography. But when I checked carefully, when I actually measured and documented, I found that my perceptions were accurate. Space really did behave strangely in certain locations, just subtly enough that most people never noticed. I started keeping a private journal of these observations. Coffee shop in the university district, where the corner booth was farther from the entrance than the back wall, despite being positioned between them. Walking path through the arboretum that took different amounts of time to traverse depending on whether you were thinking about your destination or simply wandering. Parking garage, where certain spaces were difficult to locate even when you knew which level and section they were in. The journal grew into something extensive, a catalog of minor spatial anomalies that probably existed everywhere, but that most people's consciousness automatically corrected for. Our brains were so committed to maintaining a consistent model of Euclidean space that they papered over inconsistencies, filtered out contradictions, made reality conform to expectation rather than forcing expectations to match reality. 3 months after leaving Site 7, I received a package. No return address, just a padded envelope containing a USB drive and a handwritten note from Marcus. Thought you should see this. No obligation, but if you're interested in continuing the work, contact me. The drive contained files from other research sites, locations similar to parcel 447b, scattered across North America. Each one had the same characteristics: spaces that resisted conventional mapping, areas where distance and direction became unreliable, places where human consciousness struggled to maintain coherent spatial models. And each site had cairns, or their equivalent, markers that predated modern surveying, constructed by people who'd somehow recognized these locations as significant long before we had the theoretical frameworks to understand why. One file particularly caught my attention: a site in the Mojave Desert, documented by a team that included Dr. Helen Corrigan before her breakdown. Her notes were meticulous, describing a network of stone circles that created a space where time and distance were severely distorted. She'd theorized that the circles were intentionally placed to amplify the underlying spatial anomaly, turning a subtle effect into something undeniable. Her final entry, dated 3 days before she left the site for the last time, read, "I understand now. These aren't anomalies. This is what space actually is: fluid, responsive, organized according to principles that have nothing to do with the mathematics we've developed to describe it. Euclidean geometry is a special case, a local approximation that happens to work well enough for human purposes, but it's not fundamental. The pattern beneath is vast and strange and beautiful, and I can't unsee it. I can't go back to believing that maps are true rather than useful fictions. I don't know how to live with this knowledge." I closed the files and sat staring at my laptop screen. Marcus was offering me a choice: continue the research, study other sites, build a comprehensive understanding of the phenomenon, or walk away, try to forget what I'd learned, rebuild my life on the comfortable foundation of conventional geography. Neither option felt survivable. Continuing would mean accepting that I'd spend my life studying something that would eventually break me. following in Corrigan's footsteps toward inevitable psychological dissolution. But walking away would mean living with unintegrated knowledge, carrying the weight of understanding that contradicted everything my profession believed, but being unable to do anything with that understanding. I thought about Christopher's card, still in my wallet, about his offer to talk anytime I needed someone who understood, but calling him felt like surrender, admission that I couldn't process this alone. Instead, I did something that surprised me. I started writing. Not academic papers. I couldn't imagine submitting any of this to peer review, but narrative accounts of my experience at Site 7. Detailed descriptions of the boundary zone, the cairns, the way space functioned when you stopped trying to force it into Euclidean frameworks. The writing helped. Not because it made the knowledge more manageable, but because it gave me a way to shape it into something communicable. I wasn't trying to prove anything or convince anyone. I was just documenting what I'd experienced, creating a record that might help someone else who found themselves in similar circumstances. After 6 months of sporadic writing, I had something like a manuscript. 70,000 words describing the phenomenology of impossible space, the psychology of navigating environments where conventional spatial rules didn't apply, the experience of perceiving architecture that existed in dimensions beyond normal human sensory access. I sent it to Marcus, not knowing what else to do with it. He called 2 days later. "This is remarkable," he said without preamble. "It's the clearest description of the phenomenon I've ever read. You've captured something essential that all our technical documentation misses." "What do I do with it?" "That depends on what you want to accomplish. If you're trying to warn people, you could release it publicly, though without the institutional backing of the Territorial Census Bureau, it would likely be dismissed as creative fiction. If you're trying to help other researchers, you could submit it to our internal documentation system. Or if you're trying to process your own experience, maybe just writing it was enough." "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I just know I can't keep carrying this alone." "Then let me make a suggestion. We have a position opening at Site 7. Not field researcher. We don't need another person going into the boundary zone. But we need someone to coordinate documentation, synthesize observations from multiple researchers, develop theoretical frameworks for understanding the phenomenon. It would be you, me, Christopher, and a rotating cast of field investigators. No pressure to personally engage with the anomaly if you don't want to. Just help us make sense of what we're finding." "You want me to come back?" "I want you to do what's right for you. But I'll point out that you're already living with this knowledge. You're already seeing the pattern everywhere you look. The question isn't whether you'll be affected by the phenomenon. You already are. The question is whether you want to suffer in isolation or work alongside people who understand what you're going through." I thought about it for a week, looked at job postings in my field, considered applications to other universities, explored options that would let me continue my academic career without engaging with impossible geography. But every option felt like running away from something I'd never outpace. On the 7th day, I called Marcus back. "I'll do it, but I need guarantees about safety protocols, mental health support, the option to leave if I feel I'm approaching breakdown." "All of that's already in place," he assured me. "We learned from what happened to Corrigan and Mendoza. We have better systems now, better understanding of how to work with the phenomenon without letting it consume you." 3 weeks later, I was back at Site 7. occupying the role of project coordinator for what the Territorial Census Bureau officially called the Pacific Northwest Spatial Anomaly Research Initiative. My job was exactly what Marcus had described: synthesizing field observations, maintaining documentation systems, developing theoretical models that might eventually help us understand what we were dealing with. The work was challenging and exhausting and strangely fulfilling. I wasn't alone anymore, wasn't carrying impossible knowledge in isolation. I was part of a team of people who'd all seen the pattern, who all lived with the uncomfortable understanding that space itself was stranger and more complex than conventional science acknowledged. Christopher became a close friend, someone I could talk to about the experience of perception altering without having to explain or justify. We developed a kind of gallows humor about it, joking that we were professional cartographers of the uncartographable, geographers studying territories that couldn't be properly defined. New researchers cycled through, most staying for a few weeks or months before retreating to safer work. A few stayed longer, drawn by the same combination of fascination and horror that had trapped Marcus and Christopher and now me. We were all slowly going mad in the most literal sense, our understanding of reality gradually diverging from consensus perception. But we were doing it together, which made it almost bearable. I developed protocols for managing prolonged exposure to spatial anomalies, regular rotation out of the field, mandatory counseling sessions, exercises for maintaining connection to conventional spatial reasoning. None of it was perfect, but it helped. We started to understand that you could work with these spaces without being destroyed by them, as long as you maintained boundaries, refused to fully surrender to the pattern's seductive promise of deeper understanding. The cairns remained mysterious. We documented dozens of them across multiple sites, studied their construction and placement, analyzed the symbols carved into certain stones, but we never determined who built them or why. They were old, carbon dating of organic material trapped in the structures suggested some were thousands of years old, but that just pushed the mystery further into the past without resolving it. My theory, which I couldn't prove but felt certain was correct, was that the cairns weren't built by a single culture or even a single species. They were markers left by consciousness that had learned to perceive and navigate the underlying pattern, whether human or something else, whether ancient or periodically recurring. The pattern itself was timeless, existing independent of observers, but the cairns suggested that it had been discovered and rediscovered multiple times throughout history. Late at night, lying in my bunk listening to the forest, I sometimes wondered if we were just the latest in a long series of observers to find these spaces, study them, try to understand them. And I wondered what had happened to previous researchers, not our immediate predecessors like Corrigan, but the ancient equivalents, people who'd built the cairns and tried to map the unmappable centuries or millennia before modern geography existed. Had they gone mad too? Had they developed their own protocols for safe observation? Had some of them succeeded in fully understanding the pattern, or was it fundamentally beyond any consciousness evolved in normal Euclidean space? I'll probably never know the answers. The pattern doesn't reveal itself through study. It reveals itself through experience, and experience changes you in ways that make objective analysis impossible. You become part of what you're trying to observe, your consciousness altered by proximity to the phenomenon, until you can no longer maintain the distance necessary for true scientific investigation. This is what I do know. Parcel 447B in Whatcom County, Washington, is not unique. Spaces like it exist throughout the world, places where the underlying architecture of absence becomes visible, where geometry stops behaving according to Euclidean rules, where human consciousness encounters something vast and strange and incomprehensible. The Territorial Census Bureau documents these locations, studies them, tries to understand them. But understanding may not be possible or even desirable. Some things exist at scales or in dimensions that consciousness can't fully integrate. The best we can do is catalog them, develop methods for safe observation, and warn others about the costs of looking too deep. It's been 8 months now since I returned to Site 7. 8 months of living on the edge of impossible space, feeling the pattern press against my awareness every day, knowing that I'm slowly changing in ways I can't fully control or reverse. I still create my phenomenological maps, strange diagrams that capture experiential truth at the cost of conventional legibility. I still document observations from field researchers, synthesize reports, build theoretical frameworks that probably won't survive contact with the next anomalous location we discover. And I still dream of the third cairn, standing at the heart of the boundary zone, marking something I glimpsed but couldn't fully perceive. In the dreams, I can see the network extending in impossible directions, connecting spaces that have no physical proximity, organizing geography according to principles that have nothing to do with distance or time or any of the familiar dimensions. The dreams aren't nightmares exactly. They're just true, more true than waking consciousness, which filters and simplifies and forces experience into manageable forms. In the dreams, I see reality without the protective buffer of perceptual processing, and it's beautiful and terrible in exactly the way Marcus promised it would be. I won't do what Dr. Corrigan did. I won't let the pattern consume me entirely, won't surrender my grip on conventional spatial reasoning in pursuit of deeper understanding. But I also won't pretend I don't know what I know. I've seen the architecture of absence, felt the pressure of spaces organized according to non-Euclidean principles, understood that maps are comfortable fictions rather than accurate representations. And I've accepted that this knowledge will define the rest of my life, not destroying me, not leaving me untouched, but changing me into something new. Someone who can navigate both normal space and impossible space, who can translate between conventional cartography and phenomenological mapping, who can help others understand what they're experiencing when they encounter territories that refuse to be properly known. The boundary zone is still there, just beyond the research station, doing whatever it does when we're not observing it. The cairns still stand, marking points in a network we don't fully understand. The forest grows around them, indifferent to the strangeness they contain, trees and undergrowth treating impossible space like it's perfectly ordinary. Which maybe it is. Maybe we're the anomaly. Consciousness evolved in unusually regular space, mistaking local conditions for universal laws. Maybe Euclidean geometry is the special case, and what we've found at parcel 447b is just reality being more honest about its actual nature. I don't know. The pattern doesn't answer questions. It just exists, vast and complex and fundamentally alien to human modes of understanding. All I can do is document it, study it from a safe distance, and try not to let it pull me too deep into its beautiful, terrible architecture. The cartography of absence. That's what this work is. Mapping territories defined not by what's present, but by what's missing. Certainty, consistency, The comfortable assumption that space behaves the way our ancestors thought it did, creating documentation for places that can't be properly documented, navigation guides for territories that resist being navigated. It's impossible work, but someone has to do it. Someone has to stand at the boundary between known and unknown geography, between conventional space and impossible space, and try to understand what separates them, or what connects them, or whether that distinction even makes sense. That someone, for now at least, is me, Dr. Vera Castellanos, professional geographer, specialist in liminal zones and contested territories, student of spaces that shouldn't exist but do, cartographer of the unmappable. And somewhere out in the forest, beyond the research station's lights, the cairn waits, patient in its wrongness, content to mark the boundary between what we can know and what we can only experience. A monument to the fundamental strangeness underlying all geography, all space, all attempts to impose human order on a universe that operates according to principles we're only beginning to glimpse. I should probably be more afraid than I am. Should probably recognize the danger of sustained exposure to something that's already broken other researchers. But fear feels less relevant now than curiosity, than the fundamental human drive to understand, to map, to make sense of our environment, even when our environment refuses to make sense. So I'll stay here at Site 7, at the edge of impossible space, doing work that probably can't be completed, and definitely can't be explained to anyone who hasn't experienced what we're studying. I'll create my strange maps, compile my observations, help other researchers process their encounters with geography that behaves in ways geography isn't supposed to behave. And late at night, when I can't sleep, I'll stand outside and feel the presence of the boundary zone pressing against my awareness. Feel the cairn out there in the darkness, marking territories I've barely begun to explore. Feel the vast network extending beyond what I can perceive, connecting spaces across dimensions I don't have names for. The pattern is still there, always there, waiting for anyone willing to look closely enough to see it. The architecture of absence, woven through all geography, underlying every map we've ever made. Not breaking reality, just revealing what reality actually is beneath the comfortable fictions we've constructed to make it comprehensible. That was 8 months ago. The cairn hasn't moved. The boundary zone continues to resist conventional mapping. And I'm still here, still studying, still slowly going mad in the company of others who understand. It's not a good ending, but it's the honest one. The work continues. The pattern persists. And somewhere in the forest, in the space where directions lose meaning and distance becomes negotiable, the third cairn stands, marking something vast and patient and fundamentally beyond human comprehension. I haven't been back to it since that first encounter. Haven't found the courage or foolishness to venture beyond the second cairn again. But I know it's there, can feel it even from here, a gravitational center in the geography of impossible space. Maybe someday I'll return. Maybe I'll approach it again, place my hands on those perfectly fitted stones, and let myself fully perceive the network it's part of. Maybe that would be the final surrender, the moment when I stop being an observer and become part of what I've been studying. Or maybe I'll resist that temptation, maintain my boundaries, continue this half-life between conventional geography and impossible space. Keep mapping territories that can't be mapped, documenting phenomena that resist documentation, trying to understand what might be fundamentally beyond understanding. Either way, the cartography of absence continues. The work goes on, and the pattern, patient and vast and indifferent to human comprehension, waits for the next observer to discover what space really is beneath the comfortable illusions we've built to make it navigable. I'm Dr. Vera Castellanos. This is my report from the boundary. This is what I've learned about spaces that refuse to be known. And this is where the story ends, because I've told you everything I can put into words. The rest exists only in experience, in the direct encounter with geography that operates according to rules we don't have mathematics to describe. If you find yourself in a place where distances feel wrong, where directions shift depending on how you approach them, where conventional maps fail and conventional navigation breaks down, if you encounter spaces that press against your consciousness with the weight of impossible architecture, remember what I've told you. The pattern is real. The cairns mark something significant, and the cartography of absence is written in languages we're only beginning to learn to read. That's all I can offer. Documentation of the undocumentable, maps of the unmappable, understanding of what resists understanding. The rest is silence and forest, and the patient weight of spaces organized according to principles we were never meant to perceive.